That morning, the conference room on Solara Tech's 13th floor felt more like a courtroom than a place of business. White light cut across the glass table where a thick folder titled Federal Approval, $250 million Green Energy Merger lay waiting for my signature. The air smelled of burnt coffee and ambition, slick enough to slip on. They called it a milestone day. To me, it was the day the numbers started to lie. Mark Renner, my former student, now the CEO, wore a dark blue suit and a sugar-coated tone that could rot teeth. Sitting at the head of the table, he leaned forward with that well-rehearsed smile. Eleanor, all it takes is your signature, and everything goes through. I opened the folder, flipped through the pages, and stopped at the carbon allocation ratios. One number was off. Small, but enough to turn the entire deal into a federal violation. I set down my silver Parker pen and said evenly, Mark, who edited this section? He didn't look up. Just a formatting update. Don't worry. The board's waiting on the other side. Sign it, Eleanor. Before I could answer, the door opened. Cheryl from HR peeked in, her voice slightly trembling. Ms. Price, could you step outside for a moment? I frowned but stood, pen still in hand. 3 people were waiting in the hall: a legal rep, an HR associate, and someone I didn't know. None of them offered me a seat. Due to restructuring, your position as senior federal auditor is terminated effective immediately. No apology, no explanation, just words read off like a malfunctioning script. I looked at them for a few seconds, then asked quietly, who's signing the continuous audit clause in the merger now? Silence. Cheryl swallowed hard. We'll appoint someone else. I nodded. No protest, no scene. When I went back to grab my bag, no one met my eyes. The big screen still glowed with the slogan, Sustainability Through Innovation. Mark stood by his chair, avoiding my gaze. I placed the silver Parker pen on top of the unsigned file. Someone at the far end of the table murmured, Wait, isn't she the auditor named in the merger clause? No one replied. Only the hum of the projector filled the room. That thick kind of silence people create right before they realize what they've done. I walked out of the building. The early March wind sliced my skin like paper. My hands still smelled faintly of ink, ink that had never touched the contract. On the steps, I looked up at the glass tower, reflecting the gray sky, and let out a quiet laugh. Not out of spite, but because I knew they had just burned the bridge they were standing on. They'd fired me unjustly, and forgotten that the entire $250 million deal stood on my signature. I whispered to the wind, they think they removed an obstacle. What they erased was the foundation. Then I looked straight at the security camera above the door and said softly but clearly, if you've ever seen someone punished for doing the right thing, you know exactly what I mean. Tell me where you're watching from, because there's an Eleanor everywhere, someone who does their job right, the right way, and pays for it. I turned away. Morning light caught the edge of the silver pen in my hand, and in that moment I knew the most powerful signature today was the one I never wrote. My job was never made for spotlights. No one clapped when I finished a report. No one knew the name of the person who combed through hundreds of pages just to keep a deal from falling into the lawyer's hands. I used to say, we audit the lines no one bothers to read, the fine print that keeps billion-dollar promises legal. To outsiders, it sounded arrogant, but it was only my way of reminding myself that the invisible details are the backbone of trust. At the Department of Energy, they called me meticulous to the point of annoyance. Some even nicknamed me the speed bump of progress. I never argued. If someone wanted to drive fast, they could. I'd stay behind to make sure the road didn't collapse. Once, I was passed over for promotion because of a single line in my review. Too detailed, not flexible enough. I read that line again and again and laughed. In this profession, detail saves you from bankruptcy. Flexibility is how people end up in court. I'd been doing this work for almost 12 years. On winter nights, when the city slept under snow, my office light was still on. Once, a janitor stopped by, looking at me with pity. Aren't you afraid to go home late? He asked. I said, if I leave, someone out there might have to start all over again. He didn't understand, but he didn't have to. Auditors live on precision, not sympathy. I once taught a training program for young entrepreneurs. That's where I met Mark Renner. Back then, he was a bright kid who asked questions filled with more ambition than understanding. Why is this process so complicated, Ms. Eleanor? Why not simplify it? I told him, because simplification usually means forgetting why it was complex in the first place. He laughed, took half hearted notes, and left class early that day. 8 years later, I saw Mark again at an energy conference in Denver. Stage lights hit the face of the man who once called me teacher, now the youngest CEO of Solaritech. The green hope splashed across magazine covers. He took the stage in a perfectly tailored suit, his voice polished, every word engineered for investors. We don't just produce clean energy, he said. We're building a new future. The crowd applauded. I sat in the back row, sipped my coffee, and watched him with a mix of pride and unease. You can teach someone presentation skills, but you can't teach them honesty. After the speech, he spotted me. Ms. Price, I can't believe you're still with DOE. You once told me if I wanted to change the world, start by reading the fine print. Well, I did. I smiled. I'm not sure the world needs to change that fast. He laughed loudly, shaking my hand a bit too enthusiastically. We're about to close a major merger, $250 million. And guess what? We need you to oversee the federal audit. No one does it better than you. I said yes, not because of the flattery, but because I knew the weight of the responsibility. A deal that size, if not properly reviewed, could cause damage far beyond money. When I joined Solaritech in April, they gave me a small desk by the window, facing a wall that read, "Innovation never sleeps." I couldn't help thinking, and what about ethics? Do they ever rest? The people there were young, loud, and fast-moving. They laughed at my paper notebook and silver Parker pen. Someone even called me the living speed bump. I just smiled. They didn't realize that without those bumps, the car they were driving with greed would go straight off a cliff. One afternoon, while I was checking emissions data from satellite plants, Mark came in, resting a hand on my chair. Do you know why I brought you here, Eleanor? I didn't look up. Because I don't sign until I've verified everything. He laughed. No. Because you make everyone believe everything's legal, even when it doesn't need to be that legal. I met his gaze. Progress without verification is just imagination, Mark. He tilted his head, almost teasing. That's exactly why we need you. To make the progress look legitimate. But this time, sign a little faster, will you? I stayed silent. Not angry, not surprised. I just realized that sentence marked the line between the student who once learned ethics from me and the man now teaching me how to bend it. In the days that followed, I watched Solaritech operate like a machine running too smoothly. Strong PR, sharp lawyers, brilliant engineers. But no one ever stopped to ask whether the system was still lawful. I'd saved them once before, when I caught an emissions report manually adjusted to meet EPA standards. Mark thanked me back then, saying, "You're the only one who makes me afraid to sign something wrong." I still remember those words. Proof that there was once a trace of respect in him. Now, profit had eaten it alive. I kept working quietly, reviewing data sheets, signing certificates. At night, I backed everything up to my personal drive, labeling the folder contingency. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd seen too many collapses start with one deleted line. Mark said I lacked vision. Maybe he was right. I didn't see Solaritech's future. I only saw its cracks. One morning, walking down the hallway, I overheard two employees whisper, "She's slowing the whole project down. Without her, this deal would have been done weeks ago." I just smiled. Maybe they were right, but I'd rather be hated for being slow than praised for being sloppy. At the end of the month, Mark sent out a meeting invite, merger review, final alignment. I knew what that meant. Another round of pressure. When he presented, the room cheered. I looked at the last slide where the carbon allocation ratio had been merged into a single number. I asked, "Where's the original data?" He said, "Come on, Eleanor. We're talking vision here, not spreadsheets." I replied quietly, "I always thought vision starts with seeing the right numbers." The room went still for a moment. Then Mark cracked a joke, the crowd laughed, and the moment passed. Only I didn't laugh. I sat there listening to the applause echo off the walls, and understood that the line between truth and illusion, between duty and profit, had been stretched so thin that one more touch would snap it. When the meeting ended, I gathered my papers and looked at the silver Parker pen resting neatly on the desk. I knew it wouldn't be long before they'd want me to sign fast, sign clean, sign without looking. And maybe that would be the day they finally learned the first rule of speed. When you move too fast, you don't just leave people behind. You leave the truth behind too. Some clauses in federal law sound so dry that people skip them without a second glance, but that's where real power hides. Clause 12.4, auditor continuity, was one of them. I knew, because I helped write it for the Department of Energy 8 years ago. The goal was simple: prevent companies from swapping out auditors mid process to manipulate certification results. I had written it myself, word for word. Any substitution of the named federal auditor prior to final certification shall void the legality of the compliance process in its entirety. In plain terms, fire the signer before the signature, and the entire process becomes void. No one at Solaritech knew I was the one who drafted that clause. To them, I was just an enforcer, not an architect. But I still kept a stamped and signed original copy in my personal file cabinet, a habit of someone who's seen too many companies forget that a signature is the only bridge between law and consequence. That summer, the air in the office was tight as wire. Solaritech was entering the final stage of the merger. Mark was in back-to-back meetings, appearing on television, preaching sustainable growth as if he had personally invented ethics. I stayed on the 6th floor, filtering data, correcting numbers. When Mark said vision, I thought verification. When he said momentum, I thought margin of error. One morning, Cheryl from HR stopped by with an envelope. Ms. Eleanor, here's the updated NDA. Just a formality, nothing to worry about. I opened it. Clean paper, crisp print, and something off. I'd read enough contracts to sense when a line had been touched. At the bottom, the phrase Authorized Liaison Authority, Federal Compliance Auditor, E. Price had been replaced by Authorized Representative Solaritech Legal Department. One word, just one. Auditor became representative. I looked up at Cheryl and asked evenly, "Who approved this revision?" She hesitated. "I think legal did. They said it's just to standardize formatting." I smiled, signed it, and after she left, I took a photo of the old version, the one that still said auditor, and saved it in a private folder labeled continuity/proof. I remember that moment clearly. It wasn't fear I felt, but the kind of instinct that comes from knowing when a game has just begun. I muttered to myself, they changed one word in a clause they never read. That's how collapse begins. That afternoon, in the elevator, I overheard two young employees talking about cutting audit costs and speeding up the merger. One of them joked, "It's time AI replaced auditors. People like Mrs. Price are outdated anyway." I didn't respond. I'd heard that line a dozen times in 10 years. What they didn't know was that their AI system still needed my signature to make any of its data legal. They also didn't know Clause 12.4 was the last anchor keeping their ship from drifting into legal waters they couldn't survive. That night, I got home late, on the dining table. My laptop was already open, the screen showing the continuity proof folder. Inside were 3 files: the original clause stamped by the department, the new NDA I'd just signed, and a short note from me that read, "Do not delete, may need someday." I didn't realize someday would come so soon. I made a cup of peppermint tea, sat down, and opened Clause 12.4 again. Every word felt like a small, locked door, sealing off every exit for those who took shortcuts. I thought back to the meeting last month when Mark had said, "Eleanor, every law has a gray area. We just have to move fast enough before someone turns on the light." I hadn't answered. I only thought, some gray areas don't exist because the law is unclear. They exist because people are too afraid to face the light. From that day on, I started backing up every critical piece of data to an external drive. Not because I wanted secrets, but because I'd learned that the ones who talk most about transparency are usually hiding the most. In this field, you don't need to shout to sound the alarm. You just need to keep the original copy. As Solaritech entered the signing phase of the merger, I could feel their overconfidence rising. Mark bragged to the press that all federal requirements had been met. I read the line and thought, not quite, because in my eyes, the process was still open, and if they ever decided to remove me from that table, Clause 12.4 would become a wall no one could climb. That night, I opened the continuity proof folder again, staring at the 3 quiet files inside. The screen's glow reflected on the silver pen beside me, a soft reminder that some signatures don't need ink to carry the full weight of truth. I shut down the laptop, took a sip of cold tea, and smiled. In the silence, I knew I had planted something. Not revenge, but precaution. Because in a world obsessed with signing fast, sometimes justice belongs to the one who knows when not to sign. At 9:12 on a Wednesday morning, the internal inbox pinged with a short, cold subject line. Mandatory all-staff meeting. 10:03 a.m. No explanation, no friendly emoji. At Solaritech, emails like that were never good news. I stared at the words, took a sip of cold coffee, and almost laughed. They always chose Wednesday mornings for dirty business. Mondays were too early to get angry, Fridays too late to fix anything. The 10th floor conference room looked more like a product launch than a meeting. White LED lights bounced off polished faces and glass panels, everything gleaming like a greenhouse. A faint ad jingle played in the background. Empowering tomorrow, today. When Mark walked onto the stage, someone whistled. He wore a navy suit and a smile wide enough to sell the sun. "We're entering a new era of modernization," Mark said, his voice booming through the speakers. "AI auditing will reduce human error, increase speed, and ensure total transparency." The room clapped. The sound wasn't real. It was the applause of people afraid of being the only ones not clapping. I looked past him to the big screen behind, where one small line scrolled across the bottom. Automation in federal compliance. That was the moment I straightened my back. I didn't need a photo. I'd memorized it. Every pixel of it. Mark kept talking about the digital journey, about redefining speed. Every word came out like scripture. When the speech ended, the room erupted again, and in that noise, I realized something. Everyone else was looking up. I was the only one looking down at the unsigned draft contract in front of me. 3 hours later, Cheryl from HR appeared at my desk, avoiding my eyes. "Ms. Eleanor, Mark would like to see you in the small meeting room." The room was cold and empty. Just Mark, Cheryl, and a man I didn't recognize, probably legal counsel. A white envelope sat on the table. I knew the scene. I'd seen it before, just never from this side of the table. Mark started, trying to sound gentle. "Eleanor, I truly value your contribution. But our new structure no longer aligns with traditional workflows. Your position, unfortunately, has been deemed redundant." I looked at him, not angry, just tired. "Who's signing off on the audit clause in the merger file then?" I asked, slowly, clearly. Mark glanced at the man beside him, as if waiting for a cue. "Legal will handle that," he said quickly. "The new AI system is capable of automating the process." I nodded slightly. "Is the AI federally certified too?" "Haven't seen the department issue that license yet." No one spoke. Only the low hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Cheryl pulled out a thin packet and placed it before me. "Just need your signature here to finalize the termination, Ms. Price." I read through it. Every reason was polished into corporate poetry: realignment, innovation-driven transition, position redundancy. Strange how even a firing could be written to sound noble. Signed, set the pen down, and stood. On my way out, I stopped by Mark's desk. My silver Parker pen still lay there, its engraved name slightly worn, catching the light. I picked it up, wiped it clean, then set it back down. "Keep it polished," I said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You'll need it soon." No one replied. Mark swallowed hard, his hand brushing the untouched file, labeled Federal Approval, 250 Nage, Green Merger. When the door closed behind me, The sound was sharp and final, like a lock sliding into place. I walked down the hall, past faces still laughing, chatting, pretending nothing had happened. A young employee hummed while pouring coffee, softly singing, "It's a brand new day." I smiled. It was, indeed. But I doubted they'd enjoy tomorrow morning. Outside, a cold wind swept through the glass corridor. I looked down at my empty hands. No badge, no laptop, no silver pen. Only silence remained. And in that silence, I thought of the continuity proof folder waiting quietly on my hard drive at home. Inside it, clause 12.4 was still alive, and nowhere in it did it say that a federal signature could be automated. They called it innovation. I called it selective cleanup. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. When the glass door closed behind me, I simply walked toward the parking lot, my footsteps tapping against the concrete in slow, steady rhythm, like a clock counting down to the hour. The Albuquerque sun was harsh, but the wind was cold. I opened the car door, sat in the driver's seat, and shut it. The world outside went completely silent. On the passenger seat lay my old laptop in its leather case, the only thing I'd taken with me when they fired me. I pulled it out, powered it on, and waited for the soft hum of the fan. The screen flickered to life, pale blue light reflecting across the windshield. I connected to mobile data and typed in a familiar address, DOE Compliance Portal. The secure interface appeared with the Department of Energy seal and a red warning line, Federal Clearance Access, Authorized Auditors Only. I entered my username, paused for a moment at the password field. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from how quiet everything felt. Outside, a garbage truck rolled past, wheels grinding over gravel. I finished typing the long string of characters and pressed enter. A confirmation window appeared. Confirm auditor termination protocol under clause 12.4. Below it, in gray text, this action will revoke the federal verification key associated with ongoing certification processes. Irreversible. I leaned back and exhaled slowly. Just one click. No revenge, no sabotage, just a sequence of actions exactly as written by law. The very law they'd been too arrogant to read. I moved my hand to the trackpad and clicked yes. The system asked for a reason. Auditor terminated without formal substitution. I typed those exact words. A progress bar appeared, then a final line. Federal verification key revoked. Audit continuity voided. Per clause 12.4, all pending certifications are suspended until reauthorization. And then, process completed successfully. That was it. No fireworks, no alarms, no cinematic warning for a $250 million collapse about to begin. Just a clean, lawful, irreversible act. I closed the laptop, rested it on my lap, and stared through the windshield. The midday sun bounced off the SolarTech logo on the tower in the distance, bright, loud, overconfident. I smiled faintly. They didn't read the clause. I didn't need to remind them. I started the engine, but didn't drive yet. In my head, their words echoed like ghosts. AI, auditing, modernization, redundancy. They had removed the foundation without realizing they'd just pulled the structure down. No one had to do anything. The clause worked like a preset trap. I was just the keeper of the key. They were the ones who opened it. In auditing, people like to joke that every regulation was written in the blood of those who once thought they were smarter than the law. I never joked about it. I'd seen it happen. Companies replacing people, shortening reviews, cutting corners, and then collapsing within 24 hours because of a single line they hadn't read carefully. Today, SolarTech joined the list. I opened the laptop again, not to check the result, but to make sure the trail stayed clean. Every action was logged under federal auditor, revoked, fully compliant. No malicious code, no tampering. Nothing the government could ever call misconduct. I had simply followed protocol after termination. My phone buzzed on the dashboard, a message from the office. Thank you for your service. HR will process severance within 10 business days. I stared at it for a long moment, then turned off the screen. At Solaritech, they liked the word process instead of finish, as if everything, even their own undoing, was just another procedure. I let out a quiet laugh, the kind only someone who understands justice without noise could make. Justice doesn't always speak. Sometimes it just works, precisely, quietly, and right on time. By the time I left the parking lot, the wind had picked up. The edges of the Green Merger Initiative banners flapped and curled in the gusts. I drove slowly through the gate. The security guard nodded politely, unaware that somewhere in the Department of Energy's servers, Solaritech's federal seal of approval had disappeared minutes earlier. At a red light, I looked in the rearview mirror. In the next lane, a woman was on the phone, waving her hands in agitation. I thought that in a few hours, there would be a dozen calls like that inside Solaritech. Why is the key invalid? Who revoked it? Who had the authority? I turned on the radio, an old jazz track I played when I needed calm. The notes filled the car softly. I didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel victorious. Just steady, as if I'd solved an equation exactly as written. When I got home, I set the laptop on the table and poured a cup of mint tea. Afternoon light stretched across the wall, warm and slow. I opened the continuity proof file and added one final note. Clause executed at 11:48 a.m. Solaritech auditor role terminated without substitution. Verification key revoked. Then I saved it, closed the file, and shut down the laptop. No encryption, no hiding. I knew they'd find out in the morning, but I also knew it would already be too late. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the last sound before a system collapses. The next afternoon, the house was so quiet I could hear every tick of the clock on the wall. Steady, precise, as if counting down to something inevitable. I sat at my desk, a cup of mint tea still warm, my laptop open, not because I was waiting for anything, but because I wanted to watch. When a massive system begins to collapse, you don't interfere. You just stay still enough to hear the first tremor in its frame. At 11:12, the landline rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, Washington, D.C. area code. I picked up. Mrs. Price? This is the Office of Oversight, Department of Energy. A man's voice. Polite, measured, the kind of calm that comes from years of federal training. We're verifying your auditor's signature for the Solaritech Green merger, valued at $250 million. We need to confirm you're still the designated federal auditor of record. I set my tea down, watching the still surface catch the light. That might be a little difficult, I said slowly. I was terminated yesterday. There was silence on the other end, then the faint shuffle of papers. A quiet exhale. I'm sorry. Did you say terminated? That's right, I replied. Yesterday, at 1:03 in the afternoon, HR meeting. Badge and system access revoked. Another pause, then rapid typing. You're saying they dismissed the designated federal auditor while certification was still pending? Exactly, I said, taking a sip of tea, which means Clause 12.4 is now active. No more typing. Just breathing, heavy, deliberate. The sound of someone realizing they were standing in the middle of a legal explosion. Understood, he said finally, his tone formal now. We'll suspend all verification procedures immediately. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Price. The call ended. No polite farewell. No, have a nice day. I set the phone down and glanced at the laptop screen. The DOE portal was still open. A small notification popped up in the corner. Federal audit suspended. Clause 12.4. Activation detected. I nodded once. No satisfaction, no thrill, just relief. The quiet kind, like removing a tumor buried deep in a system that had been pretending to be healthy. Workplace karma, I murmured. Not the mystical kind, but the kind built by paperwork. Justice written in signatures and sealed by negligence. The afternoon dragged on. I turned on the TV. The financial news ticker crawled across the bottom of the screen. Solaritech Midwest Energy merger temporarily suspended, pending auditor verification. The anchor's tone was careful, neutral, but I could hear the faint excitement behind it. A $250 million deal frozen over a line that read, pending auditor verification. They didn't know that the auditor in question was me, or rather, the one they'd erased. I laughed softly, not from joy, but from the perfect irony of process. In this profession, collapse rarely begins with a bang. It starts with a missing signature, a clause ignored, a person dismissed as redundant. I opened the old HR email again. Subject: Position adjustment, transition notice. I forwarded it to my private archive and labeled it Trigger 12.4, like a scientist documenting a critical experiment. By dawn the next morning, the dominoes had started to fall. Department of Energy, verification sequence suspended. Federal Treasury, merger escrow account frozen. Press release, Solaritech declines to comment. I didn't read every detail. I just skimmed enough to know every piece was landing exactly where it should. There was nothing left for me to do. By noon, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Solaritech's internal line. I almost ignored it. Curiosity won. Eleanor, Mark's voice came through, tight and frantic. We've hit a small technical snag. The department says your authorization key is invalid. Must be some mistake. Could you explain? I cut in, calm as ever. There's no mistake, Mark. My authorization expired the moment you fired me. Yes, but HR assumed. Mark, I interrupted again. You terminated a designated federal auditor without appointing a replacement. That automatically voids federal certification. It's not personal, it's procedure. He went quiet. After a beat, his voice softened, almost pleading. Maybe you could help us restore access? Off the record? Off the record? I repeated, slow and clear. That off the record approach is exactly what got you here. In the background, I heard someone shouting, The department's online too. Then the scramble of papers, chairs scraping, chaos rising. I hung up, not angry, not triumphant, just still. That kind of stillness that follows a storm, when you stand among the wreckage and realize there's nothing left to add. By evening, the headlines broke everywhere. Department of Energy suspends Solaritech, Midwest Energy merger. $250 million. Deal frozen. Investors pulled out. Stocks plunged 18% in a single hour. I watched the news, my tea long cold, and thought about Mark's confident line. AI auditing will make us faster. He was right, just not in the direction he expected. Night fell. I opened my laptop one last time, not to check updates, but to look at the DOE portal still running quietly in the background. One final message glowed on the screen. Clause 12.4. Activation status. Verification terminated. A dry, bureaucratic line, yet within it was the entire story of my life and of every person ever punished for doing their job right. I smiled faintly, closed the laptop, and whispered to the empty room, just loud enough not to disturb the quiet. Workplace justice doesn't need an audience. It only needs paperwork. The next morning, the news headline cut through the room like steel. Federal clause halts Solaritech merger, $250 million in limbo. I thought about turning it off, then didn't. For the first time, the truth didn't need me to defend it. It had made it to the airwaves on its own, on time, by the book, by the clause. The anchor spoke of administrative complications, interrupted audit chains, and personnel pending reauthorization. No one said self-destruction, but everyone understood. The phone vibrated nonstop. At the same time, my inbox lit up. The sender, Mark. First subject line, we need to talk. Second, we can fix this. Third, you can't end a 250mm merger with one clause. I looked at the last one and typed 2 words. Watch me. I hit send and closed the laptop. 2 hours later, the corporate web was on fire. A tech reporter posted a tweet. Solaritech's $250 million merger was suspended after firing the federal auditor. Clause 12.4 strikes again. Compliance always wins. Underneath, thousands of comments poured in. They called it modernization. Turns out it was negligence with better lighting. Never fire the person who knows where the real switch is. The story spread faster than any PR campaign Solaritech had ever launched. News outlets dug up the video of the AI auditing meeting where Mark had stood under stage lights preaching transparency and speed. Now that same clip played on a program called Corporate Disasters Weekly. By noon, the Financial Herald ran a 3-page feature titled The Clause They Didn't Read. The article quoted federal code, interviewed experts, and ended bluntly. Replacing a designated federal auditor before certification completion voids the merger in its entirety. Solaritech's stock dropped like a steel off its axis. Investors flooded the phone lines. The CFO, the one who once said we don't need signatures, only data, resigned within 4 hours. Inside headquarters, Mark reportedly smashed a boardroom mug after receiving the notice from the Department of Energy. Certification suspended indefinitely. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed. Again. A short message. I made a mistake. Can we talk? I read it a few times before replying. There's nothing to talk about. The system already spoke. Somewhere across the city, Mark was probably sitting in a bright, glass-walled office surrounded by screens flashing red with access denied. He still believed that if he just argued well enough, the system would unlock. He forgot. Systems don't need anger. They only need accuracy. I turned on the TV. A special business report. $250 million. Merger frozen. Solaritech faces federal audit. The reporter stood in front of the building, wind tearing through her hair. Experts are calling this a textbook case of clause ignorance, one overlooked line that brought down an entire company. My name wasn't mentioned. Good. It didn't need to be. The clause had already done its work. I brewed another cup of tea, watching the steam rise slowly through the fading light. The storm was over. No slamming doors, no pleading emails, just the wind brushing past Solaritech billboards still glowing in the night, powering the future responsibly. I smiled faintly. They'd forgotten what responsibility meant. I opened the laptop one last time and read the final headline, Clause 12.4, active status confirmed. Then I closed the lid, leaned back, and exhaled. Corporate karma doesn't knock. It audits. 3 months later, I moved into a small apartment in Santa Fe. The window faced south, where morning light filtered through silver-green leaves and landed on the oak desk I'd brought from my old office. Beside my laptop, the silver Parker pen lay still, polished, brighter than before. It was no longer a symbol of a stolen signature, but a witness to something I'd reclaimed, the right to define what's right. The name of my small company was carved on a wooden sign hanging by the porch, True Watt Consulting. No big office, no marketing team, no glossy logo. Just me, a few measuring instruments, and an old mint tea kettle. I no longer certified deals worth hundreds of millions, but I found peace in every report I wrote. I called my new work compliance for humans, auditing for people, not for performance. I started a small workshop called Integrity and Energy Auditing. The first class had only 8 students, mostly young engineers, a few environmental assessors. They sat upright with notebooks in hand, eyes bright like the first rays on solar panels at dawn. I began the session with a simple line. We don't just verify numbers, we protect the trust between people and the energy they use. A young woman in the front row raised her hand, hesitant. Ms. Price, someone said your story was about revenge. Is that true? I smiled. The question was inevitable. I set the Parker pen down and tilted my head toward her. No, I said softly, almost whispering. It wasn't revenge. It was compliance. The class chuckled quietly. Not mockery, but understanding. I went on. In energy, everyone talks about efficiency, speed, and optimization. But no one mentions that speed doesn't save anyone if the foundation is wrong. Compliance isn't a cage. It's the structure that keeps the whole system from collapsing. A young man asked, "What if people don't want to hear the truth?" I looked at him and nodded gently. Then write it down. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a voice. It comes from a record. The scratch of pens on paper filled the room. In that moment, I realized I no longer felt anger. Not toward Mark, not toward Solaritech. They were just examples. necessary lessons so these students wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. After class, I sat outside under the porch, watching the sunset turn the horizon red. One student lingered behind and spoke quietly. I used to think compliance was just paperwork, but now I see its ethics written into law. I smiled, the last light of day glinting off the Parker pen in my hand. Exactly, I said. And sometimes keeping ethics is what keeps the system alive. That evening, I returned to my desk and opened the laptop to jot down notes for the next module. Module 3, When Compliance Becomes Courage. Then I paused, looking out the window. A sparrow perched on a power line, the wind soft against its wings. No more phone calls, no pressure, no urgent midnight emails, just the quiet rhythm of real life, one that needed no signature to prove it existed. I placed the Parker pen in the center of the desk, the late light reflecting across its metal surface in smooth, gentle lines. I hadn't seen it as a tool of power in a long time, only as a reminder of limits, of the fragile line between efficiency and integrity. I turned on the recorder to capture the closing line of my first online lecture. People once built systems on signatures. I'm building mine on integrity. The wind swept through again, carrying the faint scent of mint. I turned off the recorder, leaned back in my chair, and closed my eyes. The world didn't need to know my name. It only needed to know that somewhere out there, someone was still teaching how to do things right. Not to win, but to make sure no one else fell with the wrong. The first morning of autumn, when dew still clung to the window glass, I opened the mailbox by my porch. Between water bills and a glossy spa flyer sat a thick envelope embossed with the seal of the U.S. Department of Energy. The small line in the corner made me pause. Green Oversight Board. Advisory Invitation. I stood there for a few seconds. It had been years since I'd held anything from them. The last document had been a termination letter. This time, the first line read, Dear Mrs. Eleanor Price, the Green Oversight Board invites you to serve as an independent advisor in the field of compliance and energy ethics. Your experience and principles will help us build stronger standards for the next generation. I read it twice, then set it on the table. Morning light slanted through the window, spreading across my silver Parker pen resting on the notebook. It still gleamed, still carried weight, but no longer felt like pressure. I brewed a cup of mint tea, a habit I'd never broken. The scent drifted through the room, pulling memories of long meetings, unread reports, and the day I chose silence and let the clause speak for itself. I hadn't needed revenge. I only needed justice written in the right line. And maybe, now, that justice had found its way back. That afternoon, I drove to the committee building. No hesitation this time, just a calm steadiness in my chest. At the entrance, a brass plaque read, Green Oversight Board for Sustainable Integrity. I smiled. Integrity was why I began everything. Inside, the director greeted me with a firm handshake. Mrs. Price, we need someone who asks the questions no one wants to hear and signs what others avoid. I answered, I only ask the questions that need to be asked, even when the answers aren't comfortable. Before me lay a short document, not a project, not a deal, just an official invitation to advise the Federal Energy Ethics Initiative. I picked up my Parker pen. The metal was still cool, but my hand didn't tremble. I signed, one smooth line of blue ink that faded softly at the end. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, stretching across the table. I looked at it, not as someone reclaiming dignity, but as someone closing a full circle. Some signatures build bridges. Some signatures stop collapsing. And sometimes the most righteous thing you can do is refuse to sign until the world is ready to understand why. They took my photo for the record and asked if I wanted to share a quote for the project's mission wall. I thought for a moment, then said, Some signatures build bridges. Others stop collapsing. The director smiled, saying they'd have it engraved. I simply nodded. Nothing more needed. That evening, I sat again at my oak desk, mint tea steaming beside me. The silver pen rested quietly, reflecting the last light of day. I opened my notebook for the Integrity and Energy Auditing course and added a final note at the bottom. Compliance is not fear, it's courage with documentation. I looked up, listening to the wind stir the trees outside. Somewhere in the city were people like me, the ones labeled troublemakers for speaking the truth. I wanted them to know that sometimes you don't need to shout to make justice visible. You just keep your pen steady and let the system correct its own errors. Soft piano music played in the background. Claire de Lune, gentle as the breath of a day, ending in balance. I looked at the invitation beside the pen and thought, maybe corporate karma isn't magic after all. Maybe it's just physics. You put behavior into a system, and sooner or later, the system responds. I turned off the lamp, leaving only the last natural light glinting across the table. The silver pen caught the sunset's glow, a quiet reminder that truth doesn't need noise to carry weight. I spoke softly, almost to myself. Workplace justice doesn't need an audience. It only needs to be recorded. If you've ever been called a troublemaker for noticing something wrong, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of corporate karma, where justice moves quietly, but always on time.